kapda, or makan, the three basic necessities for human life. So, which translates into food, clothing, and shelter. So, today we are going to be talking about housing and how housing is important for expats coming into a new country from the subcontinent. We will talk about the variety of housing stock available and what is the preferred choice of housing for expatriates who come in and what they move on to as they settle into the new country. And if you stay with us long enough, we will provide you a little bit of practical tips on renting, buying, and all the other processes surrounding housing. Hi, Jijo.
Hey Vivian, so you're back in India. How are you feeling?
Yeah, feeling good. I mean, I hope the mic is strong enough to pick up all the sounds of India because I am living in a first floor apartment and there's quite a bit of activity going on downstairs. So you might hear the odd scooter, you might hear the odd vendor, etc. But
I
yeah,
think
that is what makes India India,
I think
isn't it?
so far I can hear you clearly. You are so right. The basic necessities of life, roti, kapda, or makan. And I think roti and kapda is something that most definitely people would have taken care of by the time they reach a country outside of their own. So the next big milestone that you would have to beat would definitely be makan. And that's one of the reasons that we decided that we will talk about housing as an expat and what were the different troubles or roadblocks that we had to face, if at all. So I would like to start with my experience. When I came to US, as I'd spoken about in my last video, I already had friends there who were renting in an apartment and they had space for me, so I just had to drop in. But then at a later point of time when Neha moved in with me, that's when we had to look for our own place. And it wasn't as difficult or as structured as it is here in Australia. In US, you basically had to jump on Craigslist and look for a place which is in and around the area that you want to live in, and you
Mhm.
used to contact the owners directly. So I just had to reach out to someone, and we both spoke about it, and then a rough document, a rental bond was created on a legal paper, and everything was taken care of by us and the owner of the unit. When I moved to New Jersey, though, I did had to go through a real estate agent, but there again, we actually spoke to the owner and it wasn't as structured.
Mhm.
When I came to Australia, it was very different. Essentially, here, how things work is almost every property is managed by a property manager, and they are the ones who advertise the property for rentals as well as sales.
Mhm.
And when you contact through them, you have to go through a whole legal process. You have to have a solicitor involved. You have to make sure that the solicitor takes care of all the paperwork that's involved. And then everything is very legal when you're purchasing a property. And when renting a property, everything is done through the rental agent, the property manager. And there again, the rental bond is deposited with the government instead of being deposited with a person.
Yeah.
And there again, all the legal work is there. So that's how the process here in Australia is, which I think was quite different from how I experienced it in US. How was it in UK when you moved in?
Yeah, no, quite similar. So just coming back to the comparison between India, Middle East, as well as the UK as well. I think that will be useful. That will be quite interesting for our audience, I think. In India, now my sister has recently moved accommodation. She got a notice from her landlord saying that the landlord is going to put up the apartment for sale. So my sister, one day, she went, had a look at five or six apartments. She finalized one, and in a week, she was in the new apartment. So that is how quickly it can happen in India. But obviously, the processes that follow are not so watertight. So you can be caught out and you might have a few nasty surprises if you're not careful. That's number one. And in the Middle East, when we went to the Middle East, we went in as professional migrants and we were in a privileged position that we got given company accommodation in the Middle East. So we just had to land with a couple of suitcases and we had a fully furnished apartment set up for us. We just had to go there and live. Whereas it was a completely different ballgame when it came to the United Kingdom. So it was very similar to as you say. So we spent about 3 weeks in a hotel accommodation. And whilst we were in a hotel, we used to call up various letting agents in order to request a viewing for the houses. And the viewing for the houses was only done between 9 a.m. and 5 p.m. And I used to work from office. These were the days before COVID. I used to work from office from 9 a.m. to 5 p.m. So I could hardly make it back by 5 p.m. So My wife had to go along with the little daughter, the 2-year-old, to see the various houses. And I said, yeah, it's up to you. You're going to be staying in it for more time than I probably will. So if you like it, just go for it and accept it. And then it goes through a series of background procedures. Every adult will be vetted and checked. Background checks run on them. So in our case, it was my wife and myself. Both of us had some backgrounds check run on us. Both of us had credit checks run on us. And after which, there's a lot of things which happen in the background. And you get to know in about 15 days or so if you actually get the house. So that's the period of waiting, which is a little bit uncertain, and you won't even be ready to put in an offer on another house, nor will you know for sure that you've got the house that you liked already. So that's a little bit of uncertainty. But everything is taken care of. There is a very streamlined process, and they give you a very detailed inventory before you go into the house as well. And one practical tip for anybody who's coming into the UK and seeking rental accommodation is, regardless of what the inventory says, go in and take a thorough video or photographs of every nook and corner of your house, so that can serve as a time-stamped evidence in case there are claims in future. So please keep that in mind. So the entire process takes about 3 to 4 weeks. So you cannot just decide to move bags and move into a new accommodation in a couple of days. That rarely happens. If I were to hazard a number, I would probably say 90% of the rental market is within the organized sector. So letting agents take care of it. There are a few which are direct to vendor. But when we rented the first couple of years, we did not even get to speak to the owner of the house. So that's how regulated the market is.
Yeah, so in my case, there was the slight period when I was living in a serviced apartment. The way that worked was somebody had actually rented an apartment and they were subletting it. So how he had set it up is every room was rented out separately, but the rooms were fully furnished, and I just had to pay him a fixed cost, which took care of the electricity, water, as well as the accommodation. So that was how it started off when I in the very beginning. But then, like I said, with Neha, we had to actually hunt for our own place,
Yeah.
and we lived in a rental for about a year, less than
Mm-hmm.
a year. And
Okay.
then we went about getting our first property that we actually bought.
Okay.
How was it for you?
So we rented for 2 years and a month exactly.
Mm-hmm.
So we rented for 25 months. That's also because we had one property which we had put an offer on and it
Mm-hmm.
fell through. So the purchase didn't go through because the owner pulled out at the last minute saying that they don't want to sell anymore,
Mm.
which put us back by about 6 months.
Oh, okay.
So otherwise, we probably would have looked to buy in about 18 months' time. But eventually, we ended up buying in just after 2 years. That is a
Got
little
it.
bit of an emotional decision as well, isn't it? So, what governed your decision between renting and buying?
So for the longest time, I thought that I'll never buy a property because I
Hmm.
thought that it's not worth it, and that's not an aspect of living that I even ventured into. But then when we were moving, so in the first 1 year, we had to move about a couple of times. And it was essentially because we wanted to move to a bigger place. So very first unit that we lived in was 1 bedroom because that
Hmm.
was sufficient. But then we thought our parents might visit, so we wanted to move to a 2 bedroom. And while the whole movement process was going on, one fine day Neha said that like we cannot keep moving like this. I think we should find our own place. And luckily, since we had been in US for a while, we did have some savings which we could use. So I thought, yeah, if that's the case, then let's start off looking for an apartment. And back then, the Australian government had a first home buyer's option. It
Hmm.
was essentially the very first home that somebody with a permanent residence or a citizen buys. The government would give you $10,000.
Hmm.
And other than the $10,000, up to a certain amount, the stamp duty was also zero. So we thought that it was a good opportunity. And then we looked around for an apartment which was within that budget so that we can get the maximum benefit out of it. And that's how we went about getting the first 2 bedroom unit that we live in right now.
Right.
And it was frankly not that complicated a process. I mean, I think the rentals are more complicated, and
Hmm.
it could very well be because we just happened to find the right place at the right time, and everything fell into place, and it was good enough.
So that's interesting, Jijo. So what is the kind of housing stock that's available in Australia mainly? And what do the expats who come into the country for the first time normally look for?
See, I can give you from my personal experience, at least small families start off with units.
Hmm.
At least that's what I think, because houses are a much bigger investment with lot more involved. At least that was a mentality that I came in with. People usually try to go for units initially, at least to get an idea of how the living in Australia is. Now, that unit living could either be through rentals or through purchase.
Hmm.
But I think what people tend to do is they live in areas which have a bigger community which they can correlate with. So at least the initial setting in period, they are in a more familiar area instead of something that's totally new. For example, in Sydney, there are a lot of pockets which are predominantly desis.
Hmm.
So the Western Sydney area, there's a place called Parramatta, which is one of the major areas with a lot of Indian and Indian subcontinent population. And as you go west, that percentage is quite high. So people
Hmm.
tend to live in this area initially, at least to get a hold of the whole idea of living in Australia, and then they gradually spread out. So, for example, nowadays we are looking for a bigger house to move into,
Hmm.
and it's not like we want to move in right away, but we just want to understand the market. Now, having a unit to set as our base without us being worried about increasing rentals and all that was a good idea in order to start with. And that's what we went with. So here we have, like we discussed in the last podcast, we have units, townhouses, and houses. Units and townhouses usually have a strata where you have a common pool where you put in money so that the area around your complex can be maintained. But
Yeah.
whereas in case of houses, you would have to take care of everything around your
Mm.
house, and that strata expense is not there.
Yeah.
Irrespective of whether you're living in a house or a unit, you would have a council fee which you pay to the council in order to take care of your sewage and your general the waste that's
Yeah.
generated. So yeah, that's basically it. And as you go away from the city, the plot size increases, the house size increases, the unit size increases, which is common across the world.
Yeah. Yeah.
Yeah, so that's how it is. And well, Sydney happens to be one of the most expensive cities to live in, so that hit is definitely there. You have to
Yeah.
choose your location and all that. How is
Yeah.
it
Yeah.
in UK?
So it's very similar in the UK. So we have what is called HMOs, which is house of multiple occupants. And this is if you go in as a single person. It is very similar to what you mentioned. So a big house, maybe a 4 or 5 bedroom house, which just sublet individually into either with ensuite or with a common bathroom facility. So these will generally be all bills included, and these will be the cheapest form of accommodation. And next is if you come in just as a couple or with one child, then people might choose to live within the city center or close to the workplace, and because of which they might want to choose apartments or units, as you call them. And as they get more and more accustomed to the way of living, etc., then they'll seek out houses. So in houses, we have three different categories. We have terraced houses, which are basically row houses with both walls common except for the two end houses. And we have a semi detached, which is two houses, almost mirror image, stuck to one another with a common central wall. And you have detached houses, which basically sit on their own parcel of land. And as you go up the spectrum from apartments to terraces to semi detached to detached, the rents increase. It doesn't increase massively, but there is a noticeable increase in the rents. So let's talk a little bit about the rental numbers itself, I think, which will be important and which will be quite interesting for people who are looking to come into these countries. Now, London is a complete outlier, okay? So let me put that as a disclaimer. So on an average, our statistics show that the rents are about £1,100 on an average. across the UK. And in London, it is over £2,000 per month.
Mm.
The rental costs in London are almost double compared to anywhere else in the UK. And obviously, I'm talking here about averages. So you might have some things which are more expensive, some which are less expensive. But in average terms, London is very, very expensive. If you go towards the northeast, that's where you find good quality housing stock at very, very affordable prices. So that's because within the UK, it is sort of considered that the northeast has got a lower cost of living. And over the rest of the UK, spread over the UK, it will be between London prices and between the northeastern prices. So we live in the Midlands, so we are somewhere in between, not as expensive as London, definitely, which is something that we are greatly thankful for. In terms of property prices, I think it's the same as well. So the average property price in London can be in excess of £500,000, whereas in the northeast of England, you can get a decent house for about £150,000 or £160,000. And elsewhere in the country, it could be in that range of 200 to 300, where you get a good quality housing as well. So it is very, very important, especially for a new expat coming into the UK, to see where their office is and where they're required to be based. If it is London, then they need to make sure that they are being compensated adequately for the London cost of living.
So how far away from London can you stay and still have London as your base of operation in terms of work? So for example, in my case, I work in the Sydney city, and I live in the greater Sydney area, greater Western Sydney area. Okay. So it's essentially not Sydney. Like our zip codes and everything's different, but it's considered as a greater Sydney area. Okay. So is it something similar in case of London, or you just have London and the surrounding suburbs?
So you have London and Greater London, and how far you want to live depends upon a number of considerations. Is how much time do you want to spend on travel, and how much you want to spend on your accommodation itself. And it also depends on how often you need to be in the office. So if you need to be in the office every day, it probably makes sense to pay that little extra and stay closer to your office than having to spend a couple of hours on train or on metro every day getting into the office, because that will make it a very, very long day for you. So you need to balance your quality of life against the cost of living whilst making that decision. It's not an easy decision, which is why I would recommend anybody who comes in newly to London or somewhere, trials out a place by taking some temporary accommodation for 3 months or 6 months, see if that works out for them. And if it does, then move on to a longer term accommodation.
Is Greater London cheaper than London?
Yes. So the closer you go into the city center of London, the more expensive it becomes. And in fact, the housing stock is so very rare and almost unavailable in the city center that hardly anybody can afford to be within the city center just holding a professional tier 2 or a skilled visa employment job. I think it will eat up a lot into what you're earning in the month. Most people, they live in zone 3s and zone 4s of the London underground.
And how is the conveyance like how expensive is to get from a given place in the outskirts to the main city, other than the time? For example, a 1 hour ride, how much expensive, how much would
So
it
the
cost?
London transportation system is pretty good. So you can get in from zone 6 of the London Underground into the city center of London fairly quickly and fairly economically as well, because there are a number of pricing options available. So you can take off-peak options, you can take monthly options, you can take the annual Oyster card, etc. So that actually reduces greatly the cost you will be spending on the commute itself, but it's the time that you need to factor in.
Okay, because in Australia, my conveyance to my travel to work, it essentially takes me about $10 to $11 every day, as in whichever day I want to go to. So I go twice a week, and it costs me about $10. And we have something called an Opal card, which we just tap and we can just use it. And then back before COVID, there used to be, I mean, the option's still there, but essentially you have an option if you use it 10 times in a given week, then after that it's free.
Yeah.
So the maximum that you can end up paying in a given week is about $50, $70. I'm not sure if it has changed since, because they did recently increase the cost, but there is a fixed amount per week, after which they halve the rates. So it's not completely free, but they halve the cost, and then after a certain limit, it would actually, I guess it goes free, or there's more reduction involved.
Yeah.
And every day is limited to an amount. So you cannot end up spending more than a certain amount a given day.
Yeah.
So those kind of things help. But yeah, the further you go away from the city, it's obviously more expensive. I live in the Greater Western Sydney area, and it takes me about 40 minutes to reach the city.
Yeah.
So that's how it's set up. So how much?
How are the rental values and property prices in Sydney or if you
So
know the
the
rest of Australia as well.
so obviously, as you go closer to the city, the rates increase. In Australia, the rates are defined as per week and not per month.
Hmm.
And on an average, right now, I think a two-bedroom apartment, a two-bedroom unit, would come out to be about 500 to 520 Australian dollars per week. That's
Hmm.
about the average in the area that I live. But as you
Right.
get closer to the city, it can go as high as 700, 800. And
Hmm.
if you go for a house, it could definitely be much more than 500, 600. So it could vary a lot depending on the area that you're living in, but
Yeah.
anywhere from 500 to $1,000 per week.
Yeah.
And
And what about buying?
if you actually want to buy a property right now, a three-bedroom house is going for about a million and a half.
Hmm.
And if you want to buy units, they go from anywhere between 600 to 800,000. And that's just the unit cost, because then there is a stamp duty involved, and then there are other fees, like if you have to get a solicitor involved, then the solicitor cost would be added, and then usually agent asks for a certain amount as a benefit depending on the way you went about it. So that's another factor that comes into picture.
Yeah, that's all interesting. So let's talk about certain practical tips for people who come into the UK or Australia in terms of how do they go about looking for and securing their first rental property. Because I would be more than certain that 99% of us would probably prefer to rent before we actually venture to buy. So I think it would be useful to provide some practical tips on how exactly to go about securing a rental property.
So in Australia, it depends. If you come in as a student, then there's very high likelihood that you would have your own community groups. So you
Hmm.
can find people who you can live with, and essentially there is something called Gumroad here,
Hmm.
where you can find out some posts by people where they're looking for people to live with, so you can share the apartment. So that's something called Gumroad. But then if you want to go in as a family for a whole unit or a whole house, then they have quite a few websites called real estate. There's a website called realestate.com.au, and then we have something called domain.com.au. So these websites, you can actually put a filter on
Yeah.
and confirm whether you want to rent or buy, and then put the area that you want to get it in, and that's about how you get a list. And then once you have contacted someone, it's usually an agent, because almost I would believe that 75 to 80% of properties are managed by property managers. So
Hmm.
once you have connected with them, there's a high likelihood that they would just tag on and they'll show you more properties. And then they usually have open houses. So if you find a property that interests you, they would usually have an open house and you can just drop in. And if there is a specific inspection where you have to actually book inspections beforehand, usually the property listing would tell you about it. Once you have nailed down the property, like I said, you would go through the paperwork with the property manager, and then you have a lease system. So it could be a 6 month lease, 1 month lease, and then in that lease period there would be certain rules around how many times they can actually increase the property rental,
Hmm.
if at all. If you have any issues with your property, you usually go through the property manager. You almost never would know who the owner is, so that factor is there. When you are buying a property, again, there are certain warranties involved, that you have certain amount of time in which you can report, like first 30, 40 days if you have immediate issues that you can see that needs to be taken care of. Then there are obviously the building warranties. And like you said, every time you go for a rental inspection, before actually taking over the property, make sure you take photographs of, or take a video of everything that's around there, so that you know what the situation was before you moved in.
Yeah.
And when you are leaving, always make sure you take the video so that you don't see any unforeseen expenses come up. So this was true even back in US. It's always better to have a check of everything around in your unit and as to how it looks, so that whatever claims they have, they can properly release. And if you have any problem, you can reach out. They usually want you to clean your property before
Mm.
you actually move out. That cleaning can either be done by you, but preferred is get it done professionally, because that way, if they're not satisfied with the cleaning, then you can just call up the same cleaner. They usually have a warranty that they would make it ready for. So it's basically a closeout cleaning kind of stuff, where when you're actually closing out a rental account, you can have them clean, and if the owner is not satisfied, they'll come back and clean it again. So
Yeah.
that's usually what people go for. Slightly expensive, but a good
Yeah.
option.
So, as far as the UK is concerned, let me not repeat everything that you said because it looks almost identical in the UK. But people who are coming to the UK, bear in mind these two websites that I will mention. So, it is Rightmove and Zoopla. So, these cover almost 90% of the housing stock that's available in the UK. So if you're looking for an organized sector for buying or for renting, this is a tremendous option. If you want to go in for an unorganized sector or go for just renting a certain room or renting directly from landlords, etc., then you have websites called spareroom.com and you have websites like Gumtree and Facebook Marketplace, etc. So yeah, thanks for joining us on this episode where we discussed housing in the UK and Australia. As you can see, there are as many differences. As you can see, there are as many similarities between the UK and Australia as there might be differences. Thank you for joining this discussion about the housing situation in UK and Australia. As you might have noticed, there are quite a few similarities between the UK and Australia. So whichever country you choose, make sure you do a little bit of research before you set out so that it makes the process a lot simpler for you once you reach the country. And also, if you need any assistance as far as the rental markets are concerned in terms of practical tips about securing your house, about choosing the right letting agent or choosing the right property agent, do drop us a line and we'll try our best to help you. Obviously, we are not qualified to give you professional advice, but from our own experiences, I think we can provide you and guide you through a path which makes it a lot easier for you than trying to figure it out all yourself. So, hope you liked this episode of our Global Desis podcast on housing. If you did, make sure to give us a huge thumbs up and like the video because it surely motivates us and helps us to bring you better content going forward. Thanks for the conversation, Jijo, and I hope the content that we brought in today would be useful to some of our viewers. And make sure to join us on a future episode of the Global Daisies podcast, where we will talk about much more things about expat life in UK and Australia, and also sometimes in the US and Middle East. Thank you very much.
Thanks a lot, Vivian. Thanks a lot, everyone. Good day.